Thank you. But I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be learning more about the history of the American Civil Rights Movement. The end of the American Civil War in 1865 effectively meant the end of slavery, but African Americans were in for a long struggle before they were finally awarded equal rights. As of 1870, all eligible male citizens were able to vote. However, blacks were discouraged to by violence and eventually legal stipulations. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled to maintain racial segregation in private businesses in a case called Plessy v. Ferguson. Soon broadened to include schools, many southern states applied this separate but equal mentality to all aspects of life. However, this led to the application of Jim Crow laws, which resulted in blacks being treated as second-class citizens. Segregated schools, public transit, restrooms, water fountains, and more continued well into the 1900s. In 1909, a group of prominent black and white campaigners created the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. Their goal was to increase racial equality and challenge issues like the Jim Crow laws. Unfortunately, it was between 1910 and 1930 that white supremacist group the Ku Klux Klan saw its biggest expansion amid increased racial friction. Following the First World War, the NAACP was devoted to ending lynching by white vigilantes. By mid-century, the group became instrumental in the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka court case. This class action suit, filed in 1951, asked that segregation in schools be struck down. Taken to the Supreme Court, the case resulted in the first integrated school in the United States to open in the fall of 1955. Encouraged by the decision, the civil rights movement began to hold high-profile boycotts, marches, sit-ins, and other peaceful protests. These included 1955's Montgomery bus boycott in support of Rosa Parks. A watershed moment came in 1957 when a high school in Arkansas admitted a group of African American students, nicknamed the Little Rock Nine. Protested by fellow students, the governor, and even the state's National Guard, President Dwight Eisenhower eventually intervened to ensure the students' safe passage. By 1962, universities also began integrating, though black students were still met with protests and violence. The Southern Freedom Movement continued into the 60s, with support from newly elected President John F. Kennedy and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. The violence of the Birmingham, Alabama campaign influenced the president to fully endorse the movement.
A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all.
On June 19, 1963, he proposed a civil rights bill to Congress, which was approved in 1964 after his death with support from President Lyndon Johnson. The bill struck down existing legislation that allowed for discrimination, and its approval was largely influenced by Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Washington of August 1963.
With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood.
Capturing the attention of the media and the population, this event attracted hundreds of thousands of people in support of civil rights. Following that, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 ended the prejudiced voting system. Instantly effective, blacks began voting and running for public office. However, just days later, on August 11th, a violent six-day riot in the Los Angeles neighborhood of Watts resulted in 34 deaths. This was indicative of a period of racially motivated violence that occurred in the mid to late 1960s. This era also saw the rise of Black Power, led in large part by Stokely Carmichael, in opposition to extremists like the Ku Klux Klan. This ideology was exemplified by the Black Panther Party, which followed the principles set forth by Malcolm X. Rising to prominence in the 1950s, his radical ideas advocated militancy for blacks.
Black people are dissatisfied. They're dissatisfied not only with the white man, but they're dissatisfied with these Negroes who have been sitting around here posing as leaders and spokesmen for black people and actually making the problem worse instead of making the problem better.
He remained an influential and controversial human rights activist until his assassination in 1965. The murders of civil rights leaders continued when Martin Luther King Jr. was killed in April 1968 and Robert Kennedy 2 months later. Despite racial tensions continuing into the 1990s, progress has been measurable. The election of President Barack Obama in 2008 is seen by many to be a culmination of centuries of work in favor of racial equality.
This is the meaning of our liberty and our creed, why men and women and children of every race and every faith can join in celebration across this magnificent mall, and why a man whose father less than 60 years ago might not have been served at a local restaurant can now stand before you to take a most sacred oath.
Five, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire.
The Cold War saw a lot of nuclear weapons testing by the US, Soviet Union, UK, France, and others. The US did much of their early testing at Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific. The Soviets chose a remote part of what's now Kazakhstan. The story of Bikini Atoll is not a proud one for the US. Local residents there were shuffled inexpertly around nearby islands before the testing, and many were still exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. But as embarrassing as that episode is for the US, it's nothing compared to what happened in Kazakhstan. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated their very first atomic bomb in an area called Semipalatinsk, known locally as the Polygon. The region was roughly the size of New Jersey, and according to one of the program's architects, it was uninhabited. As it turns out, that claim was off by about 1.5 million people. It's hard to know whether the Soviet military was simply callous in its choice of test site, or downright sinister. There are reports of villagers being instructed to step outside their homes before detonations, so that the effect of radiation exposure could later be studied. Either way, for 40 years, from 1949 to 1989, the Soviets detonated nuke after nuke here, as many as 456 of them. That's so many that the explosions became almost commonplace for some villagers. Almost every day, recalled one woman, announcements on the radio at noon would say, "Now there is going to be a test of nuclear weapons." Everything would shake. The windows in my classroom were shattered by the shockwave from one of the blasts. All these tests laid waste to the environment. Rivers and water sources were contaminated, farmland was tainted, and the people began to suffer almost immediately. Cancer rates skyrocketed, as did mental disabilities, infertility, depression, and harrowing birth defects. All in all, around 200,000 people are believed to have suffered directly from radiation. The weapons testing finally ceased with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, but the shadow cast by the program remains long. To this day, 1 in 20 children born in the Polygon area suffer deformities. The suicide rate is 4 times the national average. And then there's the fact that when the site closed, Russia essentially just walked away, leaving untold amounts of radioactive material behind. The towns in and around the Polygon were poor enough that scavenging metal from the old facilities became commonplace, further subjecting locals to radiation. The United States caught wind of this and launched a massive effort with Russia and Kazakhstan to secretly clean up the test site, a mission that wasn't finished until 2012. The moral of this story, as if it needs one, is that nuclear testing can leave a mark on a place for generations. The residents of Bikini Atoll still understand this, and Kazakhstan understands it maybe best of all. So well, in fact, that the country has helped lead the charge to ratify the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The treaty calls for nothing less than a worldwide end to all nuclear detonations, though it won't go into effect until it's ratified by all 44 of the key nations who created it. Russia, notably, has ratified the treaty, perhaps with the memory of the Polygon fiasco still fresh. And in fact, today there are only 8 holdouts: China, Egypt, Iran, Israel, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and the United States. If you like this video, please subscribe to this channel. We're putting out news stories from around the world all the time. And thanks for watching.
In addition to being members of ethnic minority groups, American Indian individuals are also members of tribes, and Indian tribes are political groups ruled by their own governments.
Because so many people don't have a background in Indian history, Indian policy, we're not taught this in our high schools or even college courses. Indian tribes are governments, and I think even understanding that basic fact is difficult.
As a matter of fact, tribal governments are one of the 4 types of federally recognized governments in the United States. These are city governments, county governments, state governments, and tribal governments. Legitimate governments rule on the basis of their sovereignty. So what is sovereignty, and how does this concept relate to tribes?
Sovereignty is the internationally recognized power of a nation to govern itself. And Indian tribes existed as sovereign governments long before Europeans settled here.
Treaties between European powers and later the United States formalized a nation-to-nation relationship between these powers and Indian tribes. Even the U.S. Constitution recognizes Indian tribes as distinct governments. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution specifies that Congress shall regulate commerce with and enter into treaties with foreign nations and with Indian tribes. During the 1800s, the rights of individual Indians and their governments were put to the test in the U.S. legal system. 3 Supreme Court decisions from that time period serve as a cornerstone for understanding the sovereign status of Indian nations. The powers and rights discussed here only apply to federally recognized tribes. Many groups and subgroups of Indians exist in the U.S. boundaries, but not all have established their own independent relationship to the federal government, which maintains a specific set of criteria used to determine if a tribe falls into the nation-to-nation relationship. When it comes to managing tribal casinos, each tribe operates its own gaming enterprise in a way that works best for them. Some manage their gaming property themselves, while others contract with outside management or gaming corporations to manage their casinos. In any case, the tribe always makes the final decisions. Indian gaming is subject to more stringent regulation and security controls than any other type of gaming in the United States. IGRA, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, sets out the procedures and levels of this regulation. The first level is the tribal level. Each tribe has its own independent tribal gaming commission to watch over operations within their tribe. The next level is state, through what's known as the Tribal State Compacts. Finally, there is federal regulation through the National Indian Gaming Commission and federal agencies such as the Department of Justice, the Treasury Department, and the Department of the Interior.
It goes back to the beginning of time when Indian people hold each other accountable, and we have a real strong ability to do that. So, and the bottom line is we have to be accountable to our membership, and our membership demands accountability and integrity.
In summary, we can say that the U.S. government recognizes American Indian tribes as domestic sovereign nations that possess self-government. Tribes have a nation-to-nation relationship with the U.S. federal government, and state governments generally do not have powers within reservations.
"30,000 Chicanos marched through the streets of East LA that day. It was meant to be a peaceful anti-war demonstration, but within a couple of hours, it looked like a war zone. 200 people were arrested, 60 were wounded, and 4 killed. Wait, hold on a second. Let's rewind for a minute. It was 1970, it was the Vietnam War, and President Nixon had just intensified the war, even after he said he would end it. Thousands of American soldiers were returning home in caskets, and one community started to notice a pattern. Mexican Americans, who were just 10% of the population in southwestern states, were 20% of those killed in combat. This sparked a movement in defense of Latinx lives. It wasn't exactly a Black Lives Matter movement, no two movements in history are the same, but it was the beginning of a Latinx-led push for civil rights, and part of U.S. history that many in the community are making sure is not forgotten 4 decades later.
Latinos were being sent to the front lines deliberately, were lower achievers in the eyes of the government, but when it came to war and the need for cannon fodder, were prime meat.
This is Rosalio Munoz. He was an outspoken student leader back then and co-founder of the Chicano Moratorium, an organized effort to mobilize Mexican Americans and Chicanos to oppose the Vietnam War.
The disproportionate death rate of Chicanos in Vietnam, which was the primary motivation, was part of a whole web of oppression, higher dropout rates, more people going to prisons.
So on August 29th, 1970, they decided to march. It became the largest anti-war action by any ethnic group in the United States.
It was a wonderful thing, and it subliminally it got covered over by the brutal violence that followed an hour or 2 hours earlier. I remember Ruben Salazar came up to me in the middle of the march and giving me a huge abrazo and saying, "Congratulations, you did it."
Salazar was a columnist for the LA Times, reporting on issues that mattered to the Chicano community. He was also a leading voice in the community's anti-war movement. He went to the moratorium march that day, and when the protests turned violent, Salazar ducked into a local bar. A police officer had fired a tear gas canister at the bar's entrance. The police claimed the canister struck Salazar in the head and killed him instantly. But a lot of people questioned the circumstances that ended his life.
And whether it was the tear gas projectile, whether it was another shot, there's many contradictions. If he were hit by a tear gas projectile, why was his head still intact? It was a tremendous loss to us. And although he died unjustly, he left his vision for better education and justice for Mexican Americans as a legacy for the community.
The Chicano Moratorium is a significant event in LA's history, but I didn't hear about it until an ethnic studies class in college. All of that was more than a decade ago, so I began to wonder, maybe things had changed. I went back to where it all went down, East LA, to see if other people had heard about the Chicano Moratorium. Have you ever heard something that took place around here called the Chicano Moratorium?
No, I haven't.
Have you ever heard of something called the Chicano Moratorium?
No, I have not. Actually, that's new news for me.
What do you think it is, just by putting the two words together?
Moratorium, you said? I don't know, an event that has to do with Chicanos.
So you've been here 57 years and never heard of Chicano Moratorium?
No, I haven't.
But for Rosalio Munoz, that doesn't mean it didn't have an impact.
Our primary goal was to raise opposition to the war and support for more education and more participation for civil rights and social justice. And we accomplished that.